Every shipwreck I've ever dived on has a story to tell. Tales that echo from the past into the present. They speak to us of courage.
How brave those young men would have been. Step on a vessel and go to war.
Of cruelty.
We're adding massively to slaving history knowledge.
And of heartbreak.
I'm painfully aware 60 men died when the M2 sunk.
I've discovered the impact that the seas have had not only on global history.
How did she sink then? Well, that's a good question.
But also on my own family. It's been challenging.
Here we are in a decompression chamber.
It's been emotional.
Amazing just to touch a piece of history like this.
But it's also been...
Wow! Our first bit of treasure.
Lots of fun.
Ross Kemp, Shipwreck Treasure Hunter, starts Monday the 18th of April, exclusive to Sky History.
Welcome to the stage, Ross Kemp.
Hello, everybody. Well, hello, everybody.
So, let's start. We're going to get on to the diving in a moment later on, but I mean, you initially sort of came to everyone's attention as an actor. So how do you go from acting through documentaries and now to this?
Yeah, so basically, for those that don't know, I was in EastEnders for 10 years, from 89 to 99. I liked it when Andy was saying he's been on our screens for decades. It feels like hundreds of years. And that's just the audience saying that. But I finished EastEnders. I went to ITV for 4 years on a contract. And instead of working every day like you do, either you're learning lines or you're driving to the studios or you're driving back, and cheekily in between lights, I used to learn some of my lines. I've now got a lot of time on my hands, and I've been out for lunch with A.A. Gill, who's a quite famous writer at the time, sadly passed, and a very famous man called Mr. Clarkson. And they told me they just turned down a job that they were offered by ITV about Americans' fascination with firearms, which, as we know, sadly hasn't diminished in the preceding years. And they both turned it down, didn't think it was worth it, didn't like the idea of it. Anyway, that just passed in conversation. The next day, and this is before mobile phones, the landline rings, and is that Ross Kemp? And I said, yes, it is. He said, my name's Ian Smythe. I work for Lion Television. You're the first person we thought of for a documentary in America about guns. So I went, okay. Anyway, it culminated in me meeting a young man, African-American guy called Bloodhound. And it was at the time when most people didn't know about the Bloods or the Crips, which are the two main street gangs in the US and would eventually spread across the world. And so I meet Bloodhound, but before I meet him, I'm told by the American fixer that he's been shot 26 times, to which I go, no one has been shot 26 times. And as a man who's been in the military, and proper military knows, it's pretty unlikely, right? So I meet this guy, and he's got an AK-47 on the desk. He's got a Remington pump-action shotgun. He's got a .38 Smith & Wesson down the back of his pants in case either of those jam. And he's very clear to me that if there's a drive-by, which they were happening on a frequent basis in Compton at that time, that he would start firing. And I said, don't worry about that. I will be hitting the deck at that point. Anyway, I had to ask him, so apparently you've been shot 26 times. And he went, you don't believe me, do you? And I went, I'm not going to argue with a man who's got an AK-47 and a Remington pump-action shotgun, but no, not really. He lifts his top up, and he'd been cranked open twice. At one point, he'd been shot with a 9mm, which is a relatively large round, in his chest. It's missed all his vital organs. And while he's on the ground, they pulled the trigger under his chin. The bullet's gone up, taken the end of his tongue off, re-entered at the arch of his eye, travelled up between the scalp and the skull, and stopped there. And when he lifted up his bandana, which was red because he was a blood, he had a little tattoo that said "Lucky." Anyway, he proceeded to show me all parts of his bodies with holes in. The man was, a miracle or a testament maybe to modern science. But when I left there, I couldn't help thinking that he was so bright And had he been born maybe 15 blocks in a different direction, he would have been a teacher, or he would have been a banker, or he would have been something that was of benefit to society. Everybody left, the crew left, but I stayed with him and his family, and he didn't have a blonde model like you were seeing on MTV as a wife. He had a very nice wife, you know, with 2 kids on either hip, and he had a blocked toilet. So he wasn't living this kind of gangster, romantic lifestyle that was being presented by a lot of rappers at the time. And I thought that was a story worth telling. And often it's not always, you know, what you know, sometimes it's who you know. And my girlfriend at the time happened to be on a boat with someone from Sky, in fact, the head of factual documentaries. So I rang her up, even though they're on the other side of the world, and I said, I've got an idea, Ross Kemp on gangs. And we went on to make 19 of them, then went out to Afghan from 2007 through to 2013. Went out virtually every year with different regiments, first with 1 Royal Anglian, which is my family regiment, went out twice with them. And I think that sort of made me grow up, as you know, being a soldier yourself, you know, you can pretend to do things and you can think you're brave, but when you actually see the real thing and you're confronted with it, when you see people sadly lose their lives, and lots of people did lose their lives, I think it makes you grow up. It also became slightly addictive for me. You know, we could have a team ready to go at Brize Norton within 4 or 5 hours. So I'd have my body armour, my boots and my lid and my Bergen packed ready to go. And I could get a cameraman and a soundman to Brize at any point, any time of the night. And we used to go out on those old TriStars, the old Freddie Laker TriStars. And I remember the first time I ever got on one. And it's really sobering thought, because the first thing you see when you get into the aircraft are the gurneys for all the people that are going to get hurt. And that makes you think. And then you start looking around the plane and you work out the ratio of how many guys are on that plane and how many might be coming back minus a limb or an eye, or some who might be coming back in the hold in a black bag. And that's a sobering thought in itself. But the whole experience for me was one of making me just grow up. And it was about time, because I was middle-aged. So after I did that, I did Extreme World, where we traveled around the world. We made 36 of those and sort of carried on making documentaries ever since.
Yeah, just actually, talking about TriStar throws me back to when I flew into Basra for the first time, and you fly in we're on a Herc, so it's pretty thin-skinned. The aircrafts are very thin-skinned, and as you approach into Iraqi airspace, you've got to start putting your body armour on, because as we come in to land, if they shoot at you, it'll come through the plane, and you know. Anyway.
I remember once, can I just say this though? So we used to do a lot of work with the Afghan National Army, and it's called like Chasing the Dragon, because literally the OMLT, the Operation Mentoring Liaison Team, would go, we're going that way, and you'd see them going that way. And they'd generally find the Taliban very quickly, and you'd be in a 2-way range. But I remember getting on a Herc once out from Kandahar into Bastion, and they all got in behind us. And you know, you play the elbow game. Well, we're all on the same side, right? So I'm with a load of infantry, got my cameraman with me. Anyway, this guy from behind me, this Afghan, puts his elbow right in my back. So I went, I'm not having any of that. I'm putting, look. It's an hour's flight nearly for that entire flight. Me and him were fighting each other all the way in. By the time we got to actually Bastion, we couldn't afford anybody because we were too tired fighting each other.
So, I mean, through the documents, things like gangs, you did obviously stuff embedded with the forces. You must have had some close calls.
Yeah, I mean...
Some scary moments.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think anybody that is in a firefight that says they're not scared is not telling the truth, right? I think it just depends on how close it is. I think 2009 for me was when it was pretty damn hot. There used to be a saying, 8 contacts before 8 o'clock, and we'd go compound hopping. And, you know, there were rounds. I'll never forget once, there was a guy called Govan, from Govan, which is in Scotland, near Glasgow. And he was smoking Afghani pine cigarettes. And we'd just been in an L-shaped ambush in a place called the Garden. So the bullets are basically coming from 2 different directions, and you've got to push your way through it. If you stay there, you're in the killing zone, you're going to get hurt. So we get through it, and rounds are going zipping past my head. And I'd only been on the ground an hour. 24 hours before that, I was sitting in a pub on Albert Bridge in London called the Albert. So it was like a bit of a shock. Bit of a heat change as well. And I'm making my way up this channel. Afghans are really good irrigators, but they use their own poo to do so. And I always remember there was fresh mint growing by the side of this channel. So whenever I clean my teeth in the morning, I always think of something else rather than mint. Anyway, when we got through it, Govern's going to light a cigarette, and I always carry a lighter. I don't smoke, but I carry a lighter in my pocket for whatever. It is covered in mud, and probably something else, probably something Afghan. So I'm blowing it out. I get it to spark. I lean it over to light him, and as I light it, a round just goes phew, right between us. And the reaction is just to laugh, because it could have gone so horribly wrong. It was just a single round. It wasn't a lot of rounds. But we just end up laughing and giggling a lot of the time in the most, it's a natural reaction to a near-death experience. Human beings are incredible adaptive things. We are the most adaptive creature on the planet. We're also the most dangerous creature on the planet. But yeah, I think Afghan made me grow up, Andy, quite a lot.
So, I mean, you've always had quite strong connections with the military, which will play into some of the shipwrecks we'll speak about later in the series. But so moving on from the documentaries, but on to the diving. Now, you did a lot of training for the series, but your diving sort of experiences started like quite some time ago, and they weren't always quite smooth, seamless.
No, they weren't. They weren't seamless at all. So I got my PADI open water in Cyprus in '93. I was in EastEnders at the time and got a holiday. My girlfriend at the time wasn't too happy because it was a 2-week holiday, and I spent it on my own with a very good-looking female Norwegian diving instructor. Yeah, that relationship didn't last. Anyway, got my PADI and then loved it and went diving around the world, went to Australia, did a month in the Maldives. Me and my new girlfriend were diving between 2 submerged reefs.
Sorry, was your new girlfriend wasn't Norwegian by any chance, was she?
She was not, sadly. She was very nice, though, Martine. Anyway, we lose track of the divers in front of us. We're off on a dhow out of Karumba village. And so I just say, look, we'll do a safety stop, mid-water, try and keep at 5 meters for like 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll come up. We came up, inflated our BCDs, no one there. They'd gone. They hadn't counted people on, and they hadn't counted the right people off. So 6 hours later, with a head resembling a Rice Krispie, we eventually get picked up. That was my first open water experience. I had a few more after that.
I was going to say, like 6 hours floating in the water sounds pretty bad, but you managed to break that record, didn't you?
I did. And not like you. You've been doing it for a reason. You're going to assault something. You're going to take something. You're going to achieve something. This is just me being stupid. So I'm out with a very wealthy family in the Sea of Cortez. They have their own 80-foot yacht, and there's an exclusion zone around that area of the Sea of Cortez, and they've got, apparently, for some reason, they managed to get the Mexican government to allow them to sail into this area. So, i.e., there's no one going to come and get you if it goes wrong. So these guys were very keen spear fishermen. Now, the closest I got to spearfishing, or any kind of water, was driving over Chelsea Bridge on the way up to Elstree every day. So I see these guys are going down like 15, 10 meters and then staying down there for 3 or 4 minutes, shooting fish and coming up. Well, it's freezing cold. It's Christmas time. I'd rather be at home, to be honest. And there's sea lice on the water, so my bald head's getting stung. So I tell the guy on the rib, who's an Israeli bodyguard stroke minder, not for me, I hasten to add, for the rich people, that I am going to swim back to the boat, the yacht. Now, I didn't realise at the time, I'd know now, but I was trying to swim 7 nautical miles against an outgoing tide. Yeah, it's not going to work, is it? Now, I start going, but I've told him when they leave, so 2 hours later, I hear, even though I'm finning with my snorkel, I've still got my weight belt on. I'm still carrying the bloody gun. What am I carrying the gun for? Can't shoot anything anyway. I hear that. So I see them going. I'm shouting and screaming. I'm whistling. They go back to the boat. They make their sashimi. Everybody goes to sleep. Siesta. They wake up at 5 o'clock. Bear in mind, we went out at 10 in the morning. They have their drink. My girlfriend comes up, thinks I'm asleep in another bed, doesn't say anything. It's a big enough boat. There's 4 or 5 bedrooms. So everyone has their deck drinks, Everyone has a bit of sashimi. And then one of them mentions to my girlfriend, is Ross not coming up? She said, I thought he was in a different bed. Oh no, where's Ross? Goes to show I was important to him, I was. It's only taken them like 9 hours to realise I'm not on the boat. So they go out and they eventually find me in the dark. And believe it or not, I was dehydrated. I've been hallucinating. I definitely thought that 2 seals had come up to me. And of course, there's great whites in that area of the world, a lot of sharks, and they like seals. And couldn't help thinking when these 2 seals were either side of me, here I am in a black rashi, looking like the fattest seal around. I mean, if I'm going to pick one, I'm going to go for the big one in the middle. So yeah, that was my open water experience, Andy.
I was going to put you off for life, to be honest, but it didn't. So how did I know we'll get on to some of the training you had to do for the series, but how did the series come about?
So, like most things, I got into documentaries by fluke. I got into diving documentaries by fluke, really. I was working with a company called Honeybee, and we were doing a program around the UK about people who keep dangerous wild animals in their garden. And if you haven't watched the program, you'd be surprised to know how many people actually own lions in the most suburban of areas, and quite dangerous poisonous snakes. Like, there was one guy called Gary, who lives in Derby, who had 38 snakes in a 2-bedroom flat. Now, I think it's unfair on the snakes to have to live with Gary in the first place. Have you met Gary? But also, he had a monitor lizard called Thor, who's like, 4.5 foot long, that he used to take for a walk in the park. Anyway, we're making this documentary, and we met a guy who used to put his hot tub next to his lions at night so he could have a beer with his lions. Normal? Not. And I was talking to the exec, and I was saying, we were talking about holidays and places, and I used to dive. I used to go down to the Maldives, and there was a wreck called the Victory, and you could go into it at about 30 meters and come up inside it, and there was an air pocket where people took their eggs out, and it collected, and you could have a chat in the dark. And he said, so you don't mind doing stuff like that? I said, well, I'm not under keen. I don't mind that kind of thing. So without knowing, he's gone straight to Sky History, got a show commission called Ross Kemp, Shipwreck Treasure Hunter. Thanks for that. The only issue is, to be able to film underwater and work, you have to have a commercial ticket. So you have to have an HSC qualification, which is a long way from open water in Cyprus, 1993. So in 4 months, I basically went from an open water diver with the help of Mark Powell, who's a bit of a legend in the industry, with Scuba Diving International. Started off in Raysbury, and then went off to the NDC and to Cromwell, and basically went from open water to advanced rescue. And then he got properly serious when Mr. Neil Brock turned up, who again is another friend. For those of you who don't know about Neil, he owns Bristol Channel Divers. So effectively in the filming game, there's one guy that does a lot of the cinematic stuff, all the James Bond area. And then for the documentaries, effectively the Blue Planets and Beyond and everything else, it's Neil. Neil kind of runs that area. And he is an incredibly funny man. I'll give you an example. You've got to think about this joke. So we were very fortunate to dive on the Mary Rose, the first new people in 25 years to actually dive on the site. And we all meet in Portsmouth Harbour, and there's the ferry that goes to Isle of Wight. It's behind us, and I get on the boat, and I go, hi Neil, how are you? And he goes, all right. He said, question for you. What comes out of the back of cows steaming? Pretty obvious. And I go, milk. He goes, no, the Isle of Wight ferry. And that's my mate. He's always coming up with funny things as well. That's the great thing about what I love about making this documentary. It ticks a lot of boxes for me. And yeah, I think there was some over jeopardy played in the first series, which I have quashed this series, because you don't need to make more jeopardy than there already is. You're working in a hostile environment. That's ticking 2 boxes for me. You're working in a hostile environment. But for me, it's also about the camaraderie that comes through, and I don't think you can make that up. You can't manufacture that. It's either there or it's not. And Neil's very funny. I mean, he'll come up with things like this. Like we were out in the Red Sea, and I wanted to get my gloves were too long, so he's cutting off the thumb and the finger with his Gerber. And he's cutting away. He says, "Always cut away from your thumb. Always cut towards your chum. You can always get another chum. You'll never get another thumb." But it's a good advice. Cut away from yourself. Don't cut towards yourself.
Yeah, Neil's a bit of a legend. He's one of the first ADS pilots. The one atmosphere suits, those big like wearable submarine suits. He's got a photograph up in his shop of him in the massive, proper early '80s Tash, and you can tell that it's all kind of. You can tell it's an old photograph.
He's the kind of guy that would go down in a bell and with 3 other guys, 2 would work, 1 would sleep, and they'd be down there for 3 weeks, 200 plus meters.
So, I mean, it is a big shift from sort of, tourism diving in the Red Sea or the Maldives to working underwater in the UK. And we spoke about this yesterday, that, it's the old train hard, fight easy. I say to people, if you want to inspire someone into diving, then take them to the Maldives for their first dive. But if you want someone to be a good diver, you do your training in the UK, because frankly, if you can dive here, you can dive anywhere in the world. I'd
100% go with that. I'm not as experienced as you as a diver, but there are issues with diving in the UK. Obviously, the Viz being one of them. The general ratio that Neil uses, the guy we're just talking about, is 1 in 10 for Viz more than 4 meters, depending on where you are. Scapa, I should say, sorry, get sold off for that. Scapa is just an awesome place to dive. And I loved it. And it was a very important place for me because 2 of my relatives died on the Hood, and that were the last place in the British Isles that it was seen before it sailed off to get sadly blown up by the Bismarck. But yeah, I totally agree with you. But diving, the directs here are just fascinating as well. I mean, you've got such a variety. Diving in Lundy on the Iona 2, the Viz was amazing. You've got seals around you, just stunning. But then I've dived on the M2 twice now. For those of you who don't know, it's a submarine that went down between the wars. And the first time I dived on it, it was so airy. It was eerie. It was green. It was dark. You couldn't see there were holes in the sub. It felt like those men were still trapped in it. I couldn't get the thought of them out of my head on the entire dive. The next time I dived it, the Viz was great, and it was like diving on a completely different wreck. So yeah, I totally would agree with you. If you can dive in British waters, you probably can dive anywhere.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know myself, sometimes when you're working, you're filming, you're juggling a lot of balls, you're diving, and you're looking after yourself, as any good diver should be, but then you've got to use more mental sort of power to then do the job you're down there to do as well. And things don't always go to plan. Did you have any moments?
I think we've had a couple of moments. We work out a dive plan. So, for instance, if it was the M2, we'd do the last pieces to camera at the most shallowest depth, so the conning tower, and we'll go to the deepest bit first. And I work with a fantastic cameraman called Richie Stevenson, legend.
Like I said, used to be a genuinely really good friend of mine. He was at my wedding, and I've known Rich for years.
And an ex-Royal Marine as well. And I've got now with him, we kind of we don't even have to talk underwater. He feels me, I feel him, we know where we are. When I say feel, I don't mean physically feel. I mean, we know where we both are at certain points.
Well, he feels me underwater.
I'm sure he does, but you know each other. He was at your wedding.
Shall I speak to HR about that?
You should be. So there is an understanding, but that goes wrong. I've had one little bit of a kit failure once. I mean, wearing full face masks bring with them all sorts of different issues.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you said, we had a few little problems, I just want to bring up a photograph if I can.
Okay, mate.
Can we get the photograph? There we go. I mean, I'm not an expert diver medic, but that doesn't look right to me.
That was me auditioning for Quasimodo. I didn't get the part, sadly. I've no one. So, right. So this is when we were diving down the south coast. Do a dive, obviously full face mask. Coming back down up the motorway, and I look in the mirror and I go, my right eye looks a bit lower than my left eye. And I went to the director, does my left eye look a bit, my right eye look a bit lower? He went, Yeah, it does. Woke up the next morning and it had dropped even further down. So it's a bit of advice now to all divers out there. I ring up, I've got a doctor that if I need to see a doctor immediately, I've got malaria and very other things that I've picked up over the years, I can go straight to a doctor. So I ring him up, send him a picture of my face. He went, you need to go and see an optometrist in Harley Street right now. Ding, £1,000. There's nothing wrong with your eyes. There's nothing wrong with, one of them's on my chin. There's something wrong with my eyes, mate. Look at it. It's not where it should be. He said, no, you need to go and see this head specialist next door. £3,000 for an MRI. Oh, you might have a tear in your carotid artery. What do you mean I might have a tear in my carotid artery? He said, don't worry, you can't operate on it, but you'll look normalish again in about 9 months' time. Oh, do you know what I do for a living? I can't wander around like that. I'm hiding I'm like the elephant man going out to the shops. So eventually it gets better, and he says, "Oh no, I had 3 days of waiting to find out whether I had a tear in my carotid artery. No, it's not a tear. I don't know what it is. It might be your chest or something. Just be careful next time you dive. Thank you. £5,000. I got half of it back off the production company. Anyway, we go diving again. On the way back down the motorway, look in the mirror, and my eye's dropping. But this time, instead of going to the experts, the very expensive experts, I just went online. Dive clinic in pool, where the hyperbaric chamber is. Brilliant doctor there, Dr. Mark Bentley-Smith, does a Zoom with me, and he says, you've compressed your lymphatic system. It's like a big version of mask squeeze, right? And basically, when you squeeze your lymphatic system, it doesn't suddenly go the next day, ping, pop back out. It takes 4 or 5 days for it to open up again and start draining the fluid from your face, just like that. Way around it, put a hood on. So you see me in this new series, you're going, he seems to have a larger hood than he did last year. Well, that's so I can seal the mask around the neoprene rather than around my face. No problems. Sorted.
And that's the thing with it, a lot of doctors out there, if they don't dive, they've just got no concept. We can take it for granted. We all know how physics works underwater, things like mask squeeze. If you've never dived, it wouldn't even occur to you that you're going to have some sort of vacuum thing in your face, because why the hell would you? Whereas you're a diving doctor, and they're like, yeah, cool, it's this.
And he's dealing with people with the same issues on a regular basis, so he can spot things a lot quicker than your average GP. So I would advise people to use him. And it's free. It doesn't cost any money.
And can we put up another picture? Only just so we don't leave this one up for next. There we go.
There you go.
That's a hero shot. Yeah.
That's me breathing in.
With two symmetrical eyes, which is nice.
Yes, exactly. Balanced up. I'll tell you something about it as well. So we're very fortunate. We go around the world. Well, in this second series, we go to France, do the beaches of Normandy, and we do the Red Sea. But the advertising, all that gumph there, that costs more money than it does to make the program. That's the way TV works, bizarrely. The cameras that we use are cheaper than the cameras that they use to do the social media campaign. I'm just getting old, that's all I'm saying.
So, I mean, the first series, it was UK-based. You did Iona, you did Scarpa.
Went up to Scarpa.
Yep.
We did the Iona. We
M2?
did James Egan Lane, which was my most unfavourite dive. Didn't like that a lot. Shot line, missed the boat. Came down, we're at 38 metres. Couldn't see the boat, even though it was as close as I am to you. Then we went up the shot line, saw it, got into it. I had a bit of a mask issue, bit of water coming in. Couldn't clear it with the valve on the side of the full face mask. So my most unfavourite dive to date was the Egan Lane, I guess. And then we did the M2. But this one, to dive on the Mary Rose, I have to say, is probably the biggest privilege of my privileges of my life.
Yeah, I mean, because I remember as a kid, in '82, I think it was.
Yeah.
Yesterday. I remember it was a big thing, live at the BBC. Prince Charles was there, I think, because he was the head of BZAC at the time, and they brought this thing up in the cradles, and it was a huge national event.
I've just done the voiceover for the new exhibition in Portsmouth, and it's 4D. 4D, not 3D, 4D.
How does 4D work?
No idea. Anyway, but they talk about how these divers, and also, you know, they didn't have the diving equipment that we have nowadays. It was proper old stuff. And these guys were doing it for free. Men and women were turning up all days of the week, all weathers, and they dug channels underneath a buried hull, the starboard hull of the Rose, then put girders and ropes under, then attached wires to it, then put a cradle on it, lifted it up, then put another cradle under it, and then use a crane to get it out of the water. And even now, I just think that's one hell of an achievement. But then, it was extraordinary. And the great thing about, for those of you that don't know why the Mary Rose is so special, apart from it being Henry VIII's flagship, and then his most favourite ship, named after his first daughter, was that it's a time capsule for two reasons. One reason, he was actually watching it from Southsea Castle when it went down, so everybody knows where and when, which doesn't always happen in history. The other thing is that they had anti-boarding netting across the top deck and across the castles up on the rigging, so no one could get in. So it's thick hemp, covered in tar, and then rolled in sand. So even with the sharpest knife, it's going to take some time to get through it. Now, we know that she heeled over very quickly and went down. And the cries of the guys on board could be heard by Henry. And he is reported to have said, "Oh, my gallant gentlemen. Oh, my gallant, gallant men." And even when I say it now, I get emotional. You can't help it, you know? But then it lays on its side, on its starboard side. Over the years, the port side's washed away, but that starboard side is covered in a very, very special kind of silty mud that has, importantly, no oxygen in it. Now, oxygen, as we know, oxidizes, rusts, everything. It destroys everything. Eventually, it creates, but it also allows life in. So it allows worms, it allows anything that's going to destroy what's in there, it will take. But because there's no oxygen in it, you've basically mummified everything in there. And that's why they're able to bring up peppercorns. They brought up the ship's dog, you know, and the rats that he'd actually caught. So it's quite an exceptional piece of history for lots of reasons.
So, I mean, it's probably the most protected wreck site in the UK, and we've got some, relative to the rest of the world, we've got some pretty stringent and important, like, historic wreck protection acts. So how come you were allowed to dive on the wreck?
So with the help of Mallory Hass, who's my dive buddy on most of the dives that we do. She's a marine archaeologist, and I've worked with her quite a lot in the first series, and I worked with her on this series. She has connections with the Mary Rose Trust. And there is a buoy, to let people know, steel buoy with Mary Rose on it, because the yachts managed to hit it. How do you manage that? There's nothing else around for miles. Anyway, has a chain, and that chain goes down into the seabed. And over the years, it's been slowly excavating a hole. Now, when they brought the Rose up, they brought up every part of the starboard side, apart from the bow castle at the front. That was never found. And and if you watch the program, we allude to reasons why that happened. Henry was insistent that a lot of his warships had guns on the bow, because the French had galleys, that when there was no wind, and this is what happened to the Rose, two galleys came forward, their rowed, there's no wind, the Rose couldn't go anywhere. She can't sail if she's got no wind, or she sails very slowly. And they could just fire from their bows and then row back quickly without being shot and not creating much of a profile. So whether those guns are on there, and that disabled her, is yet to be totally established, but we tried to establish it in the program, and also how and why she sank. But we're allowed to go and dive on that part of the castle, and I'm really, really, I call it shaking hands with ghosts. There is something absolutely unique and fascinating about finding something and touching something that hasn't been seen for hundreds of years. It's like shaking hands with a ghost, and it makes you feel, it's just an amazing human feeling. And if you'd asked me, Andy, 3 years ago, would I be doing this, getting a buzz off it, I'd be going, not on your Nelly. But trust me, there is something incredible about finding something underwater and holding it, whether you leave it there or whether you're allowed to bring it up or whatever. But just entering some of those wrecks, and and to feel the ghosts of those young people that were on them, sadly, when it went down, particularly if people had died, is an enormous privilege, and something I intend to carry on doing whether I get paid for it or not.
Fantastic. Right. I'm going to, because yesterday we kept chatting all the way to the end. There wasn't as much time as I should have allowed for questions from the audience. So let's kick off a little bit earlier. And if you've got a question, raise your hand. I'll come out to you with the microphone and you can ask Ross a question. So, hands up. Go on. Start thinking. Ah, good man.
Don't be scared. I don't bite. I used to, but I don't anymore.
So you went out to the Red Sea, and we were out there at the same time. Whereabouts did you dive, and what was the best wrecks?
Oh, we did the kind of ones that people do. We did the Carnatic, which I absolutely loved. I love the story behind it. We did the Thistlegorm. We did the Rosalie Muller. We did another one, Dunraven. And interesting about the Dunraven and the Carnatic is the difference of a different time. You know, one was actually before the Suez Canal was built, one was just after. Captain Kerr, the young lad, who's from a very well-to-do family, wrecks the boat full of cargo. He's banned for a year, and he's allowed to go back and has a fantastic career as a skipper. The older gentleman, the older skipper, who apparently may have had one too many and wrecks the boat, sacked, never to be seen again because he came from a working-class background and worked his way up. Different times, or maybe not different times. The great story about the Carnatic, for those of you who've dived it, you know how rich it is in terms of World War II stuff. Just being in that region is really important to me for my family. So my great-grandfather was a pilot on the Suez during the Second World War, helping to get vital supplies into Alexandria to help the troops at El Alamein and at Tobruk. And my grandfather, his father-in-law, was working with the REME, the Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers, fixing tanks out in the desert during the war. So he went out in 39 or 40 and didn't come back until 46. He was still loading tanks, Sherman tanks, onto boats to come back to the UK out of Naples Harbour in 46, a year after the war finished. So it's quite an important place for me to go. And when you're on the Thistlegorm, just to sit in one of the Bedford trucks like my granddad would have driven was quite an emotional moment. So, the Thistlegorm is an amazing, it's rightly in the top 8, 10 greatest wrecks in the Red Sea, if not the world.
Yeah, I think the Thistlegorm is one of those classic wrecks that everyone knows. Next question, yes. Get my steps in.
Time. What is the most memorable thing that you've seen whilst diving?
Most memorable thing I've seen whilst diving? Gosh. I always think when we were up in Scapa, I should say, was diving on the first big battleship I dived on. Just to see something that vast underwater is just odd, isn't it? You know, you wouldn't see it anywhere else, and there it is laying there. You know, you come out of the gloom down the shot line, and there is this massive German battleship. So, yeah, I think Karlsruhe, well, the first time I saw that was pretty amazing. I think you're continuously surprised. I think that's what's so addictive about diving. There's always something else. Suddenly, finding a silver coin in Plymouth Harbour, finding a bit of the Amethyst, which at the time was the most famous battleship in the whole of the UK. I mean, it was, the Ark Royal of its day. It was the most famous battleship. Had an American skipper. He's on one side of the Sound. He goes into port, has too much to drink. It breaks anchor, and he tells the guy just to load another anchor, and it drifts all the way across to the other side of the Sound, sinks. He manages to get off, but half the crew drown. But we found bits of it. We found parts of the sheathing, the copper sheathing on the outside of it, and it has the crow's foot on it. You know, everything from the Royal Navy has that stamp of the crow's foot. So it was definitely part of the Amethyst. And to find that, to be on the seabed with a metal detector, sweeping stuff away and actually finding something, when you find a silver coin, it's just cherished moments.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like being a kid again. I remember if you find a new shipwreck, we've done it before with Rich Stevenson actually. And we had this mark in the channel about 74 metres, and you're sinking down. You know it's something. It could be a shipping container, could be a Spanish, galleon. You don't know. But you're drifting down in free fall into the blackness. And it's like Christmas morning. You're like, oh, what is it? What is it going to be? Is it going to be good? Is it going to be good? That sort of tantalising kind of just anticipation. Right. I've got time for another question.
Anybody?
Well, I've got one. So if there's a series 3, hopefully will be, have you already got your eyes on other places you want to go?
100%. I think what I'd like to do, they always have to have a hook, something different. So this is deeper and we've travelled further. I fancy, Andy, pirates and sharks.
Oh, I like that.
Pirates and sharks. So going off to the United States, East Coast, and then down past Miami, down to what are they called? The atolls down the bottom there, down towards Jamaica in that area, Caribbean.
That sounds, as much as diving in the UK is fantastic, don't get me wrong, we're all very patriotic in that. Given the choice.
Well, we'll do a couple in the UK to connect them, and then we'll slip across, mate.
Would you ever consider, so a couple of years ago, I dived the Britannic, the twin sister of the Titanic, in the Aegean. A great story. She sank in 1916 when she was being used as a hospital ship, bringing the troops back from Gallipoli and that. That's 120 metres, so that's obviously trimix rebreathers. Would you consider going down that route, doing more technical diving?
I think I could do it if I wasn't filming it. I think filming it at that depth brings in so many different issues, particularly full face mask, how you're going to mix your gases. And also, to be honest with you, sitting on a shot line for 2 hours doesn't actually fill me with.
Oh, it was more than that. So it was me and Rich again on that wreck.
Yeah.
And it was, we did an hour on the shipwreck, which is kind of...
That's a long time at that depth.
Yeah, and we did 6 hours of deco.
6 hours of deco, yeah.
But it was warm. It was the G&C, so that wasn't so bad.
Yeah. I think for me the most important thing is it has to have a story, it has to have the history, and we have to be able to tell it in a way that it slowly unravels to the audience. So if I can get away with it, I'll do it. But I'll have to take a good book down with me for 6 hours. War and Peace, or something like that.
So when's the second series coming out?
10th of April on Sky History and on Virgin.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully we'll have you back again to the dive show soon. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Ross Kemp.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, sir.